Are you ready to go?
I am ready to go, and Lita's moving the slides, so you'll hear me say change slide. Let me just do a quick sound check.
Gotcha.
I'm okay? Great. Thank you, Judy, for the thumbs up. I appreciate that. If I'm not on video, just given my home equipment, so if somebody would holler if I all of a sudden become unintelligible, that would be helpful. Thank you. So let's go to the first real slide here. What I'm going to attempt to do in the next few minutes is to kind of do some reviewing for you. This is stuff that many of you already know. There is a relationship between pharmaceuticals and Medicaid that's pretty unique and special. As advertised, we're going to talk about evidence and the hierarchy of evidence that is used to support the coverage decisions that you make in state Medicaid and other programs. And just to acknowledge here that we know that evidence isn't the only piece that goes into those decisions, but it's a key piece. Then we're going to think about what states like Washington could do when there is little firm evidence to support a decision, particularly delving into the concept of coverage with evidence development and some allied innovations. And then you're all really going to be thinking about best pathways forward for Washington as you make recommendations on this task force. Okay, next slide. So let's talk a little bit about pharmaceuticals and Medicaid. We really know that prescription drugs are a big part of healthcare spending and certainly of Medicaid budgets. They are the fastest growing component of healthcare spending in the US. And that's really due to two factors. One is that there are a lot more high cost specialty drugs coming onto the market, including genetic therapies. And the second is that those drugs can be extraordinarily expensive. So when we're talking about these kinds of drugs, we're talking about some really important innovations. There are all kinds of new oncology drugs. There are new treatments, including genetic treatments for sickle cell anemia, hemophilias. Washington is well experienced with thinking in the hepatitis C space around direct-acting antivirals. And then there are all kinds of genetic neurologic disorders that mostly come to be prominent in children and are life-limiting or life-ending, things like spinal muscular atrophy and Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Next slide. So this is a graphic from a recent January JAMA article by Darrow and colleagues. And I don't expect you to read all that small print, but what I do want you to understand is that there's just been a lot of movement in the last few years, particularly since the year 2000, around changes in FDA programs, rules, and regulations. And really since the Orphan Drug Act came in 1983, all the way up to in 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act, that these have all increased the speed with which products move their way through the FDA approval process. And that is, on one hand, great for patients who are waiting for these drugs, and on the other hand, means that the evidence that we have to support the clinical decisions that you and others need to make about these drugs is weaker. Next slide. So this is from the same article, and all I want you to appreciate here is that there are many more drugs that go through these expedited processes. So you can see that trend line going up. And then on the right-hand side of the graphic is just all the various programs under which those particular drugs are moving through. Next slide. And as a clinician, while I'm actually kind of excited about many of these things that are coming out, and I think that the pace of innovation can be just really inspiring, there are problems on the other side of that. So about 80% of drugs that are newly approved by the FDA benefit from at least one expedited program. And the proportion of these new approvals that are supported by what used to be the minimum of 2 pivotal trials has really decreased from the vast majority of 80% in the 1995 to 97 time period to just a little over half of them in 2015 to 17. And the average trial size, RCT size, did not change during that period. So it just means that we have fewer patients overall contributing evidence on these new drugs. The other issue is that overall drug approvals are really being based on not only fewer trials, but earlier stage trials. So things that used to be supported by, for example, a phase 3 study or 2 or 3 of them are now being supported by studies that might not even be randomized, blinded, controlled, or based on outcomes that matter to me as a physician or to my patients. So the FDA, when it faces this situation of approving a drug on limited evidence in these expedited processes, does require post-approval studies. Unfortunately, about a third of the time, those studies are never done. And when they are done, the vast majority of them, 2/3 to nearly all, are done using surrogate outcomes that were often used in the approval study. And only 5% of those drugs ultimately end up being able to demonstrate superiority over comparator drugs. Next slide. So I want to give you an example of that that's fairly near and dear to my heart. This is the issue of 17-alpha hydroxyprogesterone caproate, abbreviated 17P. The brand name is Makena. So between 2003 and 11, 17P was available and used by perinatologists and my colleagues, and it was available as a compounded product. So you had to order it at a compounding pharmacy. It would be turned into an IM injectable product, and the patient would get it either at your clinic or administer at home. And preterm birth is an incredible issue in the US, as it is in many countries, and it's an area where there's a lot of disparity. So it was an important thing that we felt that we were offering our patients. The FDA approved the brand name Makena via an accelerated approval pathway based on just one RCT that used a surrogate outcome, that being gestational age. And there were some other methodologic limitations in that one RCT. In the approval, the FDA required a second confirmatory trial. That was actually not begun until 2009. And it was really difficult to mount that trial because it essentially had become standard of care in America. And so the confirmatory trial was done in really different populations, a lot of them international. So there were other kinds of issues with that. When the drug was initially approved, it got 7 years of exclusivity under the Orphan Drug Act. And between the time that the pharmaceutical maker AMAG bought the company, and purchased it in 2014, and the entry of generics into that space in 2018, Makena made $1.2 billion for the company. It was a lot of money. And an awful lot of that was paid by Medicaid programs, since Medicaid is the single largest insurer of pregnant women in the U.S. That confirmatory trial did eventually publish a few months ago, and it did not find improvements in the surrogate outcomes of gestational age, preterm birth, and importantly, it didn't find any differences in the real patient important outcome of perinatal mortality. So last fall, an FDA advisory committee recommended that the FDA withdrawal support approval of Makena for preventing preterm birth. And we are still awaiting a final FDA decision on that. Next slide, please. There are some other issues around Medicaid in particular and drug approvals. And the most sticky wicket of these, and I can't at all pretend that I understand the Medicaid drug rebate program or the MDRP as well as people like Donna Sullivan do. But the MDRP has been around for a while, since 1990. It's a voluntary rebate agreement between drug manufacturers and Health and Human Services. And if manufacturers enter into the rebate agreement, they are assured coverage of their drugs by Medicaid and Medicare. And although the program is voluntary for Medicaid, all states participate and are bound by it at this point. That rebate agreement assures that states are supposed to get a rebate on the drug price, and that they are paying the lowest possible price or the best price in the US market. Next slide. But under the MDRP, as you're probably well aware, states have pretty limited management tools. They have to cover the drug in some way. If the federal rebate agreement exists, they are allowed to negotiate supplemental state rebates, although the terms of these agreements are confidential. States cannot use closed formularies, although PDLs are allowed, and prescription limits are regulated under this agreement. States can use prior authorization criteria with the PDL and medical necessity criteria fitting into those prior authorizations. But in the end, if it's FDA approved under the MDRP, states are gonna have to cover that drug in some way, even if the drug is incredibly expensive and crowds out other things that the state might want to do, and even if that drug has limited or no evidence of its effectiveness or efficacy. Next slide. So as you're all well aware, newer and higher cost therapies are increasing, and while that's exciting, state budgets, particularly in the time of COVID, are really finite and getting more so. Most states have balanced budget requirements, so the trade-offs are real. States don't have the option of printing money. So states are looking for better tools to make sure that drugs get to the populations that need them, but at the same time, not going broke doing so. So let's talk a little bit about evidence hierarchy. You can go forward a couple of slides. So this is a slide that probably looks a little bit complicated, but I'm going to talk you through the main pieces of it. This is a fairly traditional look at what we call an evidence hierarchy. As we move from the bottom, which is ideas, editorials, opinions, to the top, our confidence in what we can say about the evidence increases, and that's because the quality of the research is also going up. So let me give you an example here. Evidence really comes in two main flavors. The first are observations, and the second are experiments. So if, for example, you wanted to know if smaller class sizes improve test scores, you might do an observational study, and you could observe that class size correlates with test scores. And the obvious problem with that is that there are all kinds of things that confound the relationship between class size and test scores. So, for example, maybe kids who are in the smaller classes are more likely to come from more privileged backgrounds. And the difference in test scores that you are attributing to class size could really be due to that and other factors that go along with being in a smaller classroom. Randomized control trials are a type of experiment, and they try to address the problem that we see with observational studies by randomly assigning or allocating people to receive the intervention, in this case, the class size. So students could be randomly assigned to classrooms with 35 students or to a classroom with 17 students. And when randomization is done properly and the study is a big enough one, all of the other variables that could influence test scores, like the educational attainment of one's parents, could be evenly distributed between each group, bigger classes, smaller classes. And that allows you to essentially isolate the effect of class size without the interference of all those other variables that can have a tremendous effect on educational performance. And that's why randomized control trials are thought of as bringing more reliable evidence than observational studies. Let's go to the next slide. And what I just want to say with this graphic is that we also recognize that there are differences among these types of studies. So you can have a randomized control trial that is small and, excuse my French, really crappy. And in that case, a large and well-done observational study can actually provide better evidence than a randomized control trial. But you have to look at both of them and see what they each bring to the table. So let's go to the next slide. Unfortunately, why we bang on so much about randomized trials is that we have lots of examples of interventions where they come into being and into common use without sufficient evidence, and sometimes with almost no study at all. So I've given you here examples that all come from the pharmaceutical world, but there are plenty of examples of surgeries and other interventions where somebody just thought it was a good idea and there wasn't even an FDA looking at one small crappy trial. So in the pharmaceutical realm, we've talked about the 17P example. Most of you are probably aware during influenza season that Tamiflu was stockpiled by many states and other governments in the event of pandemic influenza. As it turns out, there were a lot of suppressed studies about this drug that the manufacturer held back. When those studies finally came to light, a high-quality Cochrane review that pooled all of those studies together, the good, the bad, and the ugly, really found that the drug is remarkably ineffective. It maybe gets people over their worst of their flu symptoms by a few hours to maybe a day, but it doesn't really keep people from dying of influenza, which is the thing we care about, or being hospitalized for it. So it ends up being a case of both wasted money and, on the part of governments that stockpiled it, also a sense of false security that they had something to really offer in pandemic influenza. They would have been better off widely encouraging immunization. Another example is antiarrhythmic drugs like flecainide used after myocardial infarction or heart attack. As opposed, they do suppress arrhythmias that you can see after a heart attack. Unfortunately, in suppressing those arrhythmias, it turns out they actually suppress the heart too, and were pro-arrhythmic in some cases. So they actually ended up causing excess deaths. And that wasted money, it wasted lives, and also on the part of my guild of clinicians, created a false sense of security that we had and also transmitted to our patients. Bad idea. And you're probably aware of Vioxx, used for osteoarthritis several years ago. And although it really is a pain, osteoarthritis is not a fatal condition, but the drug caused excess myocardial infarction deaths and other cardiovascular events like stroke, and that's all for a condition that probably can be treated in other ways. And then, a couple of weeks ago, the FDA revoked the emergency approval for hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine for COVID-19 because although data I think are still accumulating, there were excess deaths and a lot of wasted money in that space. Next slide. So I feel for you. Here you are in a circumstance where there's a fair amount of poor evidence and you're trying to make recommendations to the state of Washington. And oh my gosh, what are you going to do? What can you say here? So are states to simply throw up their hands and say, we'll cover it for all the FDA indications. Okay, we get the rebate and we'll get the best one we can and we'll negotiate for the best supplemental we can. States have a little bit of room to move about basing medical necessity criteria on characteristics of the populations that were actually studied in the approval trial or trials, and to limit use to the population that was included in those studies. Strict adherence to that kind of medical necessity criteria, that which mirrors the approval trials, is a little bit difficult because that doesn't work well at all if the FDA approves drugs with no evidence of efficacy. It doesn't work well for children where EPSDT rules apply, and it doesn't work well when states have protected drug classes. States can move forward with conditional coverage, conditional continuation criteria based on progress. So is the drug doing for that patient what it was advertised as doing, or is the patient essentially getting no benefit from it? States can negotiate price based on volume or exclusivity, usually with waivers, and that's kind of what Washington has done with Hep C treatment. States can enter into with manufacturers a price that is outcome-based. They can pay on time, they can require data for coverage and use that data to subsequently cover the drug differently than they did initially. And I don't know any state that's just printing money. And even if you could, it's probably not just about cost. It is about people's lives and trying to do the best thing for them that you can. So let's talk about one of those innovations, coverage with evidence development, and go to slide 17. So coverage with evidence development is something that is allowed by CMS and done, I would say, with reasonable frequency in the Medicare program. This is, although this guidance was issued in 2014, it's actually been done longer than this. It was just codified in that period of time. I've pulled on the slide a quote that I think is pretty telling. This is actually kind of a small document from CMS so feel free to read it yourselves. But, you know, it acknowledges that CMS has been challenged in the Medicare program and that they get a lot of requests to cover things, and that interested parties have high expectations, you know, whether it's patients or manufacturers, and that those expectations and hopes can very quickly outstrip the existing evidence base. So CMS acknowledged that it had a role to help develop evidence as well as cover things in the Medicare program, and that when approval studies were not really providing a sufficiently robust evidence base, that they would enter into these coverage with evidence development decisions. It's important to know that it doesn't apply to self-administered treatments, so it's only Medicare Parts A and B, that in these CED agreements that the routine costs of care are covered for both the experimental and control arms of people entered into the study. So just the routine care that goes around the drug, the device, the intervention is covered for both groups. Typically, manufacturers will cover the costs of pharmaceuticals or other interventions that are in the trial itself, although that can be subject to negotiation. So the study sponsor is supposed to bear the costs that are exclusive to the intervention itself, whether that study sponsor is industry or the NIH. Next slide. So there are currently 23 different treatments in the CED program with CMS. I've pulled out 5 examples here that are pharmacologic or are things that are treated as pharmacology. So hematopoietic stem cell transplants for a whole bunch of different conditions, platelet-rich plasma injections for non-healing wounds, bed sores essentially, and diabetic leg ulcers. The off-label use of a whole host of drugs for colorectal cancer. And again, near and dear to my heart, these last 2 are things that your Washington HTA has taken on in the last 2.5 years. So pharmacogenomic testing for warfarin dosing early on, and vagus nerve stimulation for treatment-resistant depression. In the case of both of those things, your HTA clinical committee decided that there actually was plenty of evidence to decide that neither of those things would be covered, and made that decision, but they are CEDs in the Medicare program. In the case of vagus nerve stimulation, the clinical committee actually spent a lot of time talking about whether people could appeal to be in the clinical trials. And there is a way of doing that through the Washington Medicaid program and other insurance. So CMS will stop a CED program if it gets to the point that there's more definitive evidence, either pro or con. So for example, PET or positron emission tomography for particular types of solid tumors, mostly brain tumors, but some others as well, went into the CED program in 2004, and it was determined that it was effective as a way of helping to stage and manage those kinds of solid tumors. And so the CED was discontinued and the intervention is just covered as of 5 years after that. Next slide. Private insurers have been less on board with CED. They've kind of just said experimental, and we don't cover things that are experimental. One really prominent example is the Wisdom trial that is run out of UCSF. They enrolled basically all the commercial insurers in California and also in Missouri, interestingly. And it's a comparative effectiveness study that compares age-based screening at 40 years of age versus risk-based screening for women for breast cancer. It's a big trial. It's trying to enroll 100,000 women. It really got started off because UCSF investigators and Blue Shield of California were on board and convinced other people to be on board. It was funded by PCORI, and it's due to run its course and report out in the next 3 to 5 years. Next slide. So I think you can explore coverage with evidence development is an option in the Medicaid program. As we noted before, states can allow participation in trials and in doing so, paying for the routine costs of care that they would be paying for anyway. And Washington can do this. States could participate in evidence development while just covering the treatment. They could decide to cover it, but gather evidence that would help them to fill in gaps that the studies haven't answered. A lot of these conditions end up being fairly uncommon. That's not true with hepatitis C, but lots of other things are fairly uncommon. And state data collaborations across states can help to gather data faster and accumulate numbers. These efforts do require a fair amount of coordination and effort. It puts a lot on the state program to essentially be running a study. To that end, academic partners can be super valuable, and outside funding is something to consider as well. So again, it would be best if the FDA did all of this in the approval process, but that comes at the cost of time. And there's been a lot of outcry on the part of the public and industry to get the FDA to approve things quicker, but there are trade-offs there. Next slide. One example of data collaboration across states is the SMARTEN Project, or the Spinal Muscular Atrophy Research Effectiveness of Nusinersen Project. That is run out of the center that I work at and is jointly funded by the Drug Effectiveness Review Project and the Medicaid Evidence-Based Decisions Project. There are 7 participating states. Spoiler alert, Washington is not one of them, but Washington will get access to what is found in this particular data gathering exercise. It is looking at children who have SMA types 1 or 2 and are not already enrolled in a trial, with the drug being covered by their state Medicaid program. It's looking at important outcomes like death, need for permanent ventilation, and the child's motor function over time. It's gathering a very few other data points to help with the analysis, including age, sex, what the diagnosis exactly was, and the date of diagnosis, and the use of physical therapy or other care modalities. It's going for a 30-month data collection period and is due to complete late next year. Next slide. Just a super brief tour through other things that states can do. So thinking about prescription drug alternative payment models, there are many things that I know you've talked about and explored on other calls. Next slide. And these kind of break down into 2 flavors. One are the financial-based models. On the other are the health outcome-based models. What we're really talking about so far today are the health outcome-based models. You've spent a lot of time talking about the financial-based ones, so I'm not really going to go there. But in the health outcome-based ones, there are conditional coverage, that's coverage with evidence development, or coverage for treatment continuation. That would be things like approving nusinersen for continuation in a infant or child who was improving or at least maintaining with their SMA with use of the treatment. And then there are performance-based arrangements that may be outcome guarantees, so that the insurer is paying only for particular kinds of outcomes, and another where the insurer may be paying for a particular constellation or process of care pattern around that condition that involves the use of that treatment or intervention. Next slide. In the center's SMART-D work, which many of you on the call are aware of, we did some surveying of a bunch of states and their readiness to engage in APM development, and talked to them about what kinds of drugs were ripe and ready, and were they ready to think about. And the ones on this list were really the ones that rose to the surface in those conversations. So I don't think that any of these pharmaceuticals are particularly surprising to see on the list, but I'll ask you to reflect in your conversation time about whether there's anything here that you think should be here and you're not seeing on the list. Next slide, please. And this is super similar to the graphic that Mike showed at the beginning in his introductory comments, but just to say that, you know, we know that the context and the environment in which you live and make decisions is really all important. So you have some degree of research evidence that's available to help inform these decisions, but you also have a population that has particular needs. You as a state have particular values or preferences or needs, and there are also resources, not only financial resources, but whether or not there's the expertise in your state to even do something. So, you know, an example is CAR T therapies, and that just isn't done everywhere. So decision-making really is something that happens at the nexus of all three of these circles, but is always in the context of the bigger environment and bigger context. So let's go to the final slide. I think that's just questions and your discussion. So just to sort of kick that off, some things for you to think about as you discuss are what do you think is the role of evidence in Washington as you make these decisions and programs and plans, and how explicit should the state be about the trade-offs? Things that are potentially good for individuals aren't necessarily good for the population, and how there's always going to be tension there. Health is but one priority that a state has. So how do you balance off what you're paying for pharmaceuticals and what you're covering in the Medicaid program and other health insurance versus schools and corrections and roads and other things? There are always trade-offs. And do you think differently about this by condition, by drug, by population, by who manufactures the drug, by some magical price or quality life year threshold or something else? Do you think about it differently by a particular evidence threshold? So those are some things that you could reflect on in the discussion that you're going to be having here. And then last slide. So let me ask if you have any technical questions about what I've talked to, but I'll turn it back to Mike to moderate and facilitate this discussion.
Val, thanks so much. That was really helpful. Lita, could you just go up to the prior slide? I'm just, as people are looking at those and kind of reflecting on Val's comments, I didn't see anything in the chat box, but anything kind of come to mind as you guys are thinking through some of this. I think, Val, I like the way you've kind of outlined this, and I know we're going to get into some deeper discussion after John's presentation as well. But I'm kind of curious of any initial thoughts from folks.
I could, I think, I'd say versus the health versus other state priorities and needs. I think that we do need to be mindful of other state priorities and needs, but I think that as the healthcare authority, our role here in particular is to be advocates for health. I think it is an important priority, and that if we aren't advocates and we're trying to make those other trade-offs within our own group, that it will, we will end up being an afterthought, or we will lose the advocacy that other priorities will have on their own behalf.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, great point.
I had a question on the list of diseases that I kind of gathered that states felt comfortable kind of looking at their options, and I just didn't have a chance to read it well. Was sickle cell on there?
It was, Stephanie, I do not believe it was.
Yeah, and so my question would be is why not? Is, especially because that community is so underserved and often neglected.
I think, Stephanie, this is Donna, I can speak to that.
Okay.
When the SMARTEN Project kicked off, that was, wow, probably almost 5 years ago now. The sickle cell products were so far deep into the pipeline that I don't think that they were really being bubbled up to the surface, because there weren't any good drugs on the market. So that was before, the newer product that was just approved for the hemoglobin, and the gene therapies were so much further away from being real life than some of the diseases that were listed here. But if it were today that we were developing the list, sickle cell would definitely be on that list.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Donna, this is Valerie. I think that's absolutely correct. And this is not an all-inclusive list. This is what bubbled up to the top over the last 5 years.
Great.
Other thoughts? Val, one thing that came to mind is I really liked your example on 17P. I mean, I think that has a lot of relevance of how we're looking at this. And I'm just kind of thinking, as you kind of look on your career, look back, I mean, what would you have done differently had you been in a policy-making decision, a policy decision-making position back then, and you think about, solidifying a different type of contract? How would you approach that differently?
Mike, it's such a good question, and I can tell you what I did as a clinician. So, based on observational studies only, I ordered the compounded version of 17P for patients.
Right.
That's what I did. Because why? Because recurrent preterm birth is a horrible thing. Bad enough the first time, worse the second. And the drug, what we did have, if we didn't know that it would definitively help, what we had was evidence that said that it didn't hurt. And at the point that it was compounded, it was also dirt cheap. You could do it for between $200 and $300 during a pregnancy. So low cost, low harm, maybe an upside.
Got it.
So that's what I did, and that's what most people did.
And Mike, at that same time, there was a war on compounding pharmacies also, where if a product was available commercially, that pharmacies were not allowed to compound it for, you know, mass dispensing. They had to compound it on a patient-by-patient basis. So that's another, you know, another avenue where it really impacted states.
Mike, I have a comment here from Vivian Soter. She said another issue is walking back interventions when assessment of the evidence changes. Quite difficult to get clinicians to stop using non-evidence-based drugs. 17-OHP is a good example of this.
Great. Vivi, can you want to expand on that?
I was at the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine meeting in February this year, and there were a number of different discussions and lectures about 17-OHP. I didn't go to the one that a representative from the FDA attended, but what I did hear was that they said there was not going to be another trial, and so I think it's highly unlikely the FDA will continue to approve this drug. But all the clinician meetings I went to, clinicians said they still believed it and they were still going to use it. And although there's no evidence of harm, there really isn't any definite evidence that there isn't harm. My own home, the United Kingdom, has never used 17-hydroxyprogesterone for preterm labor prevention. They just felt the evidence was insufficient. But I do think in America, there's a sort of, in my specialty anyway, a more is better approach. And I think maternal fetal medicine doctors in particular right now are having a really hard time letting go of 17-hydroxyprogesterone.
Yeah, I think that's very right, Vivian. And the other thing I would say is that we could have done a lot to decrease perinatal mortality disparity with that 1.2 billion that AMAG earned by selling the drug in this country. And that is, I think, a real reflection of the cost that we could have put people in better housing. We could have given them better support and better nutrition, and we could have made sure that they got into SUD treatment when they needed it. There was a lot we could have done with that money. And while I think that people who take care of expecting moms are going to be resistant to not using this drug, a lot of that has to do with we don't have other things to offer from our offices.
Right.
It might be easier to fund a drug than to fund better housing and social circumstances.
Right.
It's the way we've constructed our system, and it's fantastically easier. Yes.
Hey, Donna and Judy, I have just a question for you guys. As you guys think about coverage with evidence development and knowing what you guys have done on the SMART-D, specifically with Hep C, I'm just kind of curious on how this plays out when you have one manufacturer with that innovative breakthrough drug and there's no competition. And how does that play out in terms of where's the leverage? And I'm just kind of curious on your thoughts. I mean, what you guys have done on the Hep C front was, very kind of groundbreaking, but at the same time, you had two manufacturers that you could kind of, or more, that you were able to use almost against each other and get the best deal. How are you guys looking at that coverage with evidence development if there isn't that?
Great question, Mike. They say it's a negotiation when both parties can equally walk away from the table. We can't walk away. We're required by law to cover these drugs. So we really have no leverage. A great example is Vertex Pharmaceuticals with the cystic fibrosis drugs. They've brought out, 3 drugs over the past probably 10 years that are all kind of groundbreaking, but they hold a monopoly on really the treatment for cystic fibrosis, and they are not willing at all to give discounts to the state Medicaid program. So other than begging and pleading for price discounts, there's really not a lot of leverage that we can do or can insert. Which is why we believe that having some sort of registry or a way to track the outcomes of the patients that are receiving these medications is extremely important, because as we can gather more evidence to show that it either does or doesn't improve clinically meaningful outcomes in patients, then we might have the ability to maybe get an outcomes-based contract, or put pressure on them from a regulatory standpoint where they might lose their FDA indication if they don't do additional studies.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think one of the parts that is hard, and I think why Washington decided not to take part in the SMARTEN is that it's hard and expensive on the state side to get those outcomes and track stuff. And I think Hep C is a good example of that. We think and we hope people are gonna collect post-viral loads and ensure that the Hep C infection is cleared, but there isn't a way that we can for sure guarantee that. And so that makes all of this a little harder, not to say that we still shouldn't try to do it, but makes it a little more challenging.
Mike, this is Carly. I wanted to jump in on some of the questions that were presented on this slide as I was thinking about looking at pathways that vary by drugs or condition or manufacturer or price. I think that Donna really highlighted the challenge here is that in theory, you could think about doing any of these things, but at the end of the day, you have currently there's no leverage to actually, or there's no mechanism really to actually follow through on many of these things. And it makes me think of, Oregon, where they are supposed to have a mechanism, right, with the prioritized list where you can think about conditions or something like that. They actually do have a mechanism to try to, prioritize or create a pathway to not cover things based on evidence, but it all comes back to the Medicaid drug rebate program. And if a manufacturer is participating, even with that prioritized list you have in Oregon, you essentially have no leverage or no ability to say no.
Right. No, fair point. Other thoughts? Hey, before I saw a list growing here, I just want to make sure. Monica, Petra, and Foxy. I thought you guys maybe joined just a few minutes late after we did intros. You guys all on right now?
I think Monica had to step away. She sent me a chat,
okay,
and she'll be back shortly.
Okay.
This is Foxy. I'm still on.
Great. Thanks, Foxy. Any other thoughts, questions, comments regarding Val's slides? Well, Val, thank you. I mean, I think that was very helpful. And I think, Donna, the way you just teed this up, you started talking about the need for data and, outcomes and potentially this next step, even with registries. So I think the segue could be very beneficial as we kind of transition over to John. But I want to just do a little time check. We're 10 after 2. Would people like maybe a 5-minute quick standing break? And then we can we'll come back. Does that sound fair? Looking at some nodding heads here.
Thank you. That would be great.
Let's take a 5 minutes. We'll be back at 2:15, and John, we'll go with you.
Sounds good.
Thanks, guys.
Kristen, should I give you or Vivian control for the presentation?
It would be great if you could give me control first, and then partway through I can tell you, is it easy for you just to switch it then over to Vivian, or I can advance her slides if it's...
Yeah, no,
okay,
I can.
Great.
And do you want to just control my slides, or do you want to present your own screen?
Either way, I can control your slides. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, you know what? I'll let you present because it's saying you'll have to switch to the desktop version of GoToMeeting to use my keyboard. So I'll just switch to you as the presenter.
Great. Oops.
All right. Guys, hang tight. Looks like we still got a few more folks coming in right now. All right, well, let's get going. John, Vivian, Kristen, thank you guys so much for taking time. I think you maybe got a flavor of kind of what this group has been dealing with over the last hour and kind of what lies ahead for them. But I think it segues well into kind of your overview. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. So the floor is yours. Thanks.
Great, thanks. I'm just going to tee this up and then get out of the way for my smarter colleagues to actually do the presentation. The Foundation for Healthcare Quality has been around for about 32 years, I think, this year. And among the programs are the clinical outcomes assessment programs. These programs actually look at clinical data abstracted from patients' medical records and look at the clinical care that's being developed. We have clinicians, physicians, nurse midwives, others who look at the clinical care being developed and help improve the care at the bedside. So that's what these programs do. Primarily, they're focused right now on procedural medicine. So we have a surgical program, cardiac program for cardiac interventions, spine surgery, and obstetrics. However, we're very much interested in getting into outcomes programs that look at medical outcomes as well. And we are looking, we have been actively engaged in trying to put together a program around biologicals in the rheumatology arena. In that regard, I want to really thank Valerie for that last presentation. I thought it was fantastic, and it's very helpful for us to see where this committee is going and what your needs might be going forward with this project. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kristen, and thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you for having us, and thank you, John. So as John mentioned, we're going to talk today about the care outcomes assessment programs, sort of the basis for the model of these programs, and then specifically how we've used OB-COPE to do some tracking of outcomes around emerging therapies. So we'll give some specific examples from the OB side, but the basic model applies to all of the clinical areas where we have programs. And then also, I think, as you all know, the BRE Collaborative, the Washington Patient Safety Coalition, and Smooth Transitions are also part of the programs that fall under our umbrella. So the model of the COPE approach is really built on continuous quality improvement, really looking at making the knowledge to practice loop and looking at how that change can happen, identifying what you want to change, measuring, implementing, and then measuring again to see what's happening. And the programs are collaborative. We look at benchmarking and comparative reporting. We have meetings to look at the data and to share best practices. We're working on increasing transparency among both within the program as well as externally and in the public arena. They're clinician-led, which I think is one of their strongest points, that there's a management committee that really looks at the strategic direction and plan for each of the programs. And they're multidisciplinary clinicians and stakeholders. So in the spine arena, we have both neurologists and orthopedic surgeons. In OB, we've got the community midwives talk with the maternal fetal medicine specialists and, you know, everything in between. So I think that multidisciplinary input is really a key part of how this works. And then the clinical data, it's as John was mentioning, it's high quality chart abstracted data. It's timely reporting at the aggregate and the system level. As well as looking at individual provider, and it can also be drilled down to the patient level to give sites the ability to go down and look at where the fallouts are. They can look at a comparison of outcomes before and after the implementation of quality improvement initiatives so that they can see the impact of those changes. We can also examine balancing measures. So are things we're doing to lower the cesarean rate, are they having a positive or a negative outcome on newborns? Are there more babies going to the NICU? Those are important things that we need to be looking at in order to evaluate whether quality initiatives are having the impact we want. We can also look at the evaluation of the site and practice culture. So looking across sites, really important, you know, with the ability to look not only within your own hospital or your own system, but to look across the entire cohort and see, you know, what are my, you know, what's my competition doing across town or across the state, and how does that impact, you know, what direction we want to go in. And then there's also the ability to monitor resource implications and costs. We can look at, you know, staffing things and cost of care and those kinds of things to connect that with the clinical data to see, again, what kind of impact we're having overall. So we think that that's really, you know, sort of the key of why this clinical data is so important and really the basis for the model that we use in the COPE programs. So specifically with our OB COPE data, the heart of the OB COPE database is the pregnancy and delivery care. So everything that happens on consecutive deliveries from the time of admission through delivery. But added in with that to give us a full picture of what's going on are the demographics and risk factors, the provider information. So we know not only the provider name and their MPI number, but we also know the provider type. So we can do some analyses by looking at specific provider types in comparison. And their role, which is really critical for looking at attribution, especially in OB, where one practitioner may be admitting the patient and doing most of the labor management, but when a cesarean comes, if it's a CNM or a family practice physician that doesn't do cesareans, somebody else steps in and does that cesarean. So in order to really look at an individual practitioner's performance, we have to be able to look at the attribution of care. We also know transfers of care. So if patients have had a planned out of hospital birth, either in the home or in the birth center, we know if those come into the hospital or from a lower level hospital, a level 1 facility transferring into a higher level of care. We know the outcomes for both maternal and newborn, and 30-day readmissions. Specifically for on the maternal side, with the newborns, we only know if they come back to the same facility for a readmission, so we know that we miss some of those in the database. A few areas where we're looking at adding data, and we've got some current collaborations going on to examine adding patient experience data and looking at that in conjunction with the clinical outcomes, the financial data, and long-term maternal and newborn outcomes. So those are areas that we're investigating and currently working to expand the database. Just a little bit here. This is a very busy slide, so I've got some animation added here, so it's not quite as overwhelming when it opens up. But the whole idea is just for you to be able to see the continuum of the fields and where in the point of care we collect these kinds of things. So as I mentioned, with practitioners, we're looking at the different practitioner types in the different practitioner roles. Same with nurses, so we know what nurse is working with them upon admission, the primary person during labor management, and who was there at delivery. We have a lot of date and time fields, so we're able to examine many different points in care throughout labor and delivery. We know cervical dilation at different points in time, the mode of delivery, and then, as I mentioned, the postpartum 30-day readmission. This is a little bit about who is currently in OB-COPE. We're getting about 35,000 deliveries a year added to the database, and we have over 200,000 records in there now. So it's a really rich source to look, even now, looking retrospectively at the data that we've collected. There's 20 hospitals in Washington, and also we have a facility in Montana participating, and they represent all levels of neonatal and maternal care, so levels 1 through 4. We have the planned community births through the Midwives Association of Washington State. So those are all the planned home and birth center deliveries. They represent, they're in urban, suburban, and rural areas. There's some tiny places. There's some very large places. As you can see, we don't have really anybody in North Central Washington currently participating. There's, not a lot of facilities there, but there certainly are some critical access hospitals, and so we're, hoping to get more of those sites participating so that we can be sure that we're representing what's going on, especially in those critical access hospitals. And then we have all obstetrical provider types represented, as I mentioned, OBs, family practice with and without cesarean privileges, maternal fetal medicine, the OB hospitalists, nurse practitioners working within a hospital, and then the community professional midwives working on the home and birth center settings. So that's just a little overview of our current data and the platform from which we're operating. And then I'm going to turn it over here to Vivian to give some actual real-world examples of how we've utilized this data to look at emerging therapies. So Viv, would you like me to advance the slides, or do you want to turn it over to share your screen?
You can advance it just now, Kristen.
Great.
Can everyone hear me okay with my phone?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Just let me know if it's not working. So I did think about including 17-hydroxyprogesterone. Maybe that would have been a good one to choose. But I've chosen two real-world examples of how OB-COPE has, as a data, quality improvement program and data registry, been able to track some new interventions. Now, I have to tell you, innovation in obstetrics is actually quite unusual. We have very, very few new therapies. We tend to reinvent our own old therapies. And compared to other specialties, we're really not doing very well on this front. But I've got two, I think, pretty interesting examples. Kristen, do you want to move on? So the first one is the use of what we call late preterm steroids. Now, I don't know how many of the audience really have a good handle on obstetrics, but as Val said earlier on, preterm birth is a big, big issue in the United States. It's associated with a lot of cost, a lot of short-term impacts on babies, and a lot of long-term impacts on babies and families. And we have known for about 30 years that if the mother receives antenatal corticosteroids within a week roughly of the birth of a preterm baby born at less than 34 weeks, that there are real benefits to the baby, both in survival and also in reducing morbidity for these babies. However, it's been unclear if what we call late preterm babies, babies born between 34 weeks and 36 and 6 weeks, if giving them antenatal steroids is associated with any significant benefit in terms of newborn complications. Kristen, do you want to move on? So about 5 years ago, a study was started in the United States to answer that question. Does antenatal betamethasone, which is the most commonly used antenatal corticosteroid, reduce newborn complications for babies born at 34 to 36 weeks? Now, I should tell you that our preterm birth rate is actually quite low in Washington State compared to a lot of states. It's usually in the 8 to 10% range. However, most of these babies are not born less than 34 weeks. Most preterm babies are actually born between 34 and 36 weeks. So this study was designed with a primary composite outcome as their primary outcome. And it was really a combination mostly of respiratory complications with some other complications for the baby. And what this study found was that the risk of the newborn complication composite was about 11.6% in the betamethasone group and 14% in the placebo group. So this was statistically significant and suggested that betamethasone reduced the risk of these complications by about 20%. Interestingly, and probably not surprisingly, we found that babies that were exposed antenatally to betamethasone had a higher rate of neonatal hypoglycemia. So 24% in the betamethasone group versus 15% in the placebo group. Neonatal hypoglycemia can be treated if it's recognized, and it should be recognized in late preterm babies. And if it's very severe, there is concern that this may have long-term impacts on development of the baby. It's kind of controversial exactly how severe the hypoglycemia has to be, but there is a question about whether this really is a long-term issue for babies. Do you want to move on, Kristen? So at the time that this was published, we felt there were, really a lot of issues with this paper. First of all, that 34 to 36 week period there's a lot of maturation that goes on in the baby at that time, and the rate of complications at 34 weeks is a lot higher compared to 36 weeks. In addition, when we looked at our own data in OB-COPE, 50% of all late preterm babies were born at 36 weeks, the time that the risk of complications was the lowest. We found that the risk of complications at 36 weeks is relatively low in terms of respiratory complications, about 16%, and most of these were fairly minor complications because they weren't associated with intubation or ventilation. In addition, the study was underpowered to evaluate the effect of steroids week by week. And at this time, actually, we wrote and published a paper just highlighting the issues we thought potentially with implementing a policy of late preterm steroids across the board. So I think this speaks to really looking at evidence and basing evidence on one trial. When I said that there wasn't any, data on, the study wasn't powered to look at outcomes week by week. In the appendix of the paper, which, how many times do you look at the appendix? They did actually do a sub-analysis and looked at the newborn complication rate by two groups. One was at 34 to 35 weeks, the earlier gestational age at birth, and then at 36 weeks. And what they found that clearly at 34 to 35 weeks, there was a benefit of giving antenatal steroids, but at 36 weeks, although it was underpowered, there was absolutely no evidence whatsoever of any benefit. In addition, in the appendix, they also looked specifically at severe respiratory complications. And if you look down at the bottom, you'll see that at 34 to 35 weeks, there was no statistically significant difference in severe respiratory complications. And in fact, although it wasn't statistically significant, at 36 weeks, the relative risk suggested there may be a trend towards more severe respiratory complications in the group that received the betamethasone. So in fact, although this study was touted as, showing benefit across this late preterm period, really there were some issues with just where that benefit was. So after the study was published, ACOG produced a committee opinion. They've revised it a couple of times, but it's largely the same, which is that administration of betamethasone may be considered in pregnant women between 34 and 36 weeks who are at risk of preterm birth within 7 days. So what happened in the OB-COPE population? So we were able to track this. And what you can see along the x-axis is each quarter from quarter 3, 2016. I only did it up to quarter 1, 2019 because I had that data handy. On the y-axis, you can see the percent of steroid exposure, percent of all late preterm births, all preterm births who were exposed to antenatal steroids. At the top, you'll see the early preterm births. So about 80% of them across the whole time period were treated with antenatal steroids prior to birth. And then if you look at the purple line, this shows the percent of late preterm births who received any antenatal steroids. And you can see that it's gone from about 30% to about 38, 39%. So we're definitely seeing more use of steroids in late preterm birth. And when you look at all births, you will see again on the y-axis, this is the percent of all births in purple that received antenatal steroids. It's gone up from 3.8% to 5.2%. So what that means, it looks very small numbers, but actually If you translate this into all births in the United States, it's almost 300,000 of the 3.9 million births in the United States received preterm steroids or antenatal steroids. And then in the blue line, you'll see that this is the rate of babies that were actually born at term who received antenatal steroids at some point during the pregnancy, probably because there was some concern they might deliver early. And that's gone up from about 0.8% to 1.3%. So there's an increase in the use of steroids in babies that are born late preterm, but also more babies who are born at term are also getting steroids, and that's because we're not very good at predicting preterm birth. So one of the great things about having OB-COPE in a registry like this is that we can look at exactly where these new therapies are actually being implemented. So I broke the cohort down into two periods. The blue is a period at the end of 2016, which I'm going to call baseline, which is just around the time that this evidence was coming out, before really the ACOG statement had time to make a big impact. And then in purple, I've got a cohort from later on, from 2018, early 2019, and that's in purple. And we can see if, how this is being implemented across our population. And what you'll see that in fact, across all populations, all racial and ethnic groups that we have information on, that the rate of the rate of antenatal steroid use went up. We can also see this sort of information even by the patient's insurer, so that we could see on the right that there was a statistically significant increase in antenatal steroid use in patients with commercial health insurance. And there was a smaller but not statistically significant increase in the use of antenatal steroids in Medicaid patients. This might actually be one time that I think it might be of benefit that this wasn't perhaps implemented so vigorously in the Medicaid population. We can also see what type of hospitals are actually using the therapy more commonly. So along the x-axis, you'll see level 1 hospitals, level 2, and level 3, 4 hospitals. And you'll see that most of the increase in use of antenatal steroids has occurred at level 3, 4 hospital. So why is this so important? Well, more than 1 in 20 of all singleton babies in OB-COPE, and in fact about 1 in 16 of all babies born in the OB-COPE cohort now is exposed to antenatal steroids. And because we're not very good at actually predicting preterm birth, of those who receive antenatal steroids, about a third are born less than 34 weeks. So that's the kind of population that really, really needs steroids. About 45% are born at 34 to 36 weeks, when the benefits are probably there at 34 weeks, not at all there at 36, I would say. And about 21% of all the antenatal pregnancies associated with antenatal steroids are actually born at term. This would be fine if there was no risk-benefit ratio, but there really is a big question mark over antenatal steroid exposure and whether this is entirely benign for the baby, particularly babies that are born, receive antenatal steroids during pregnancy, and then go on to be born at term. There's just been a big paper published in JAMA from Finland in May, which suggested there was an increased risk in babies exposed to steroids antenatally and born at term in terms of behavioral issues and neurodevelopment. There have also been some questions about an increased risk of metabolic disease later in life, potential for babies who are exposed to steroids and deliberate term to be smaller for whatever reason. And also we've got this question about the short-term and potentially long-term effects of neonatal hypoglycemia. So has it improved the outcomes in our late preterm birth in Washington State, given that we're exposing a lot more of the patients to antenatal betamethasone? So along the x-axis is again just the year and quarter and the percent of late preterm babies who had any of these issues. So you'll see the orange line is intubation, and it's a very, very small percentage of these babies are intubated. Ventilation, again, it's a minority of them, and you can see that the line has really not changed over the last few years. Oxygen use is unchanged. Respiratory complications, which is kind of a broad bag of things, maybe going up a little, but certainly hasn't gone down. And NICU admissions are pretty much exactly the same. But in addition, not surprisingly, based on the ALPS trial, is that since 2016 to 2019, the percentage of late preterm babies that are having issues with hypoglycemia, shown in the blue line, has gone up quite a lot. It's gone up from 15% to 23, almost 24%. And another thing that we have seen in our data that has not been reported before is that we're also seeing more of what we call temperature instability, or issues with these late preterm babies maintaining their body temperature. And if this happens, it means that the baby may have to go into a warmer or incubator again, may have to be separated from the mother. And this was something that wasn't looked at in the trial. We also have the ability to look at resource use over the same time period. This is again for late preterm babies only in our OB-COPE data. This is the median length of stay in hours for late preterm babies from 2016 baseline to Q1 2019. And you'll see that there certainly hasn't been a decrease in the length of the hospital stay for late preterm babies. If anything, it looks like it may have increased over that time period. So I'm going to just mention another trial and another new therapy that sort of happened in the last few years. For many years, we told patients if you have an induction of labor, your risk for cesarean birth increases. And what we didn't really know was whether this was due to induction of labor itself or the indication for induction. So in 2018, another big randomized controlled trial was performed, reported in the United States, to assess the effect on the baby of induction of labor at 39 weeks in first-time mothers where there was no reason to induce the labor. It was totally elective or non-medically indicated. The primary outcome was how the babies did, whether they had any complications or died, and a secondary outcome was cesarean birth. And what they found was that the primary outcome, how the babies did, whether you induced the mom at 39 weeks or whether you just expectantly managed them, there was no difference for the baby. However, the secondary outcome, cesarean birth, appeared to be lower in the induction of labor group, with about a 16% lower risk of cesarean birth if induction of labor at 39 weeks was performed. So this was really embraced by a lot of people in the community. However, there were some issues with the study. Notably, the average age of patients in this study was 23 years. Now, in our OB-COPE data for this same population, the average age is 28 years. And we know that as you get older, things get more complicated and labor doesn't always work just quite the same way it does if you're young. Do you want to move on, Kristen? Thanks. So, what happens in the OB coat population? Well, I am going to try and show you something that I think is kind of a nifty way to look at this. I wonder if, yeah, great. I'm going to try and share my screen.
I'll turn it over to you, Vivian.
Thank you. Are you able to see my screen just now?
Yes.
This is actually a presentation of our data using a Microsoft platform called Power BI. And this just shows how we can use our really granular data to really quickly explore trends and changes in our population. So this is actually a cohort of the NTSB population, the licorice, first time pregnancy, term, singleton, one baby, vertex, head first presentation of the baby. And this is a group that we use a lot in the United States to kind of compare metrics. Along the top bar, you'll see the number of deliveries, which is 34,000, or about 8,000 cesareans performed, which gives a cesarean rate of 26%. About 35% were induced, and so on and so forth. Over here under percent cesareans, there's a box which has a number of key metrics. I have it actually on percent cesareans. I can click through it and hit the number of patients, the percent of operative vaginal birth, third and fourth degree lacerations. There are a whole lot of things I can look at. In the next box, I can click and see if labor was allowed or a cesarean was performed with no attempt at vaginal birth. In the next box, which is this brownie color, I can look at whether the labor was induced and filter it by inductions or spontaneous labor. I can look and see who was the type of clinician at the time the patient was admitted for labor and delivery, whether it was maternal fetal medicine, OB, midwife, family practice. Underneath that, I can look at the practitioner in a different way, looking at who actually did the delivery. If you move to your left, at the bottom in purple, I can see the racial and ethnic distribution of patients. And I can also filter all the metrics by that. And on the left, you have in the blue bars just the number of deliveries. You can see that on the left y-axis. On the right y-axis, you can see the percent of the population who had that intervention. And the red line shows you the trend over time. So I can look very quickly and show you that since January 2016 to Q3 2019, of all our NTSB patients, the rate of all of these patients who actually had an elective induction or non-medically indicated induction of labor at term went up from about 1% to almost 4%. And if I, again, just look at all inductions, should change on the bottom. You can now see that almost 10% of all inductions of labor in our population are elective inductions of labor. The rest will be things like preeclampsia or concern for the baby's well-being or whatever. So how has that changed our C-section rate? So I can click on the percent of C-sections in the same time period. And I can look at it just for those where labor was allowed. And you can see that in the bottom left-hand corner, that red line is pretty much flat. So what we can see is that we're seeing an increasing number of elective inductions of labor, and we're seeing really no change in this NTSB population in the cesarean delivery rate. So can I hand over back to you, Kristen?
I'll switch back.
Thank you.
But Vivian, I'm going to at some point go back to that, because that is an amazing tool. And I think the question is then, how do we have other emerging therapies have a tool like that, right? I mean, that's impressive.
Yeah, and I can go back to it in a minute or two. Kristen, do you want to just show my last slide? That would be great. So right now, randomized controlled trials are the gold standards for testing new therapies in medicine. But this is my personal view. They nearly always in my specialty suffer from being performed in relatively narrow populations and under very strict management conditions. Monitoring how these therapies are implemented in the real world and their consequences, both intended and unintended, patient outcomes, and their implications for healthcare resource use, I think is a really crucial and largely underappreciated issue, at least in obstetrics. I think data registries and quality improvement programs like OB-COPE can really fill this gap and see what happens to resource use and outcomes, and also how therapies are actually implemented in different, hospitals and by different providers and in different racial and ethnic groups. And then I see the future for a lot of these trials not in fact being standard randomized controlled trials, but this is happening in Europe. I think it's probably beginning to happen in other specialties in the United States. But this potential for doing what's called step wedge cluster randomized trials, where therapies are actually implemented in hospitals sequentially, and the before and after effects in terms of outcomes are measured using the hospital as its own control. And I think this is another context where OB-COPE, for example, could actually play a really big part in not just monitoring, but also testing new therapies. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you guys very much for that. I didn't see anything in the chat box, but would welcome thoughts, comments. And maybe I'll just start with where I kind of left it, Vivian. I mean, as you guys kind of have looked at what this group is reviewing in terms of emerging therapies, and just as I was even looking at that tool, how do you see you guys evolving, to kind of look at some of this newer emerging stuff that's coming out, even certainly in the pharmaceutical space? I mean, is that a tool that you're looking at would be applicable in other settings?
Yes, I mean, I think over the next few years, I know this is mostly about emerging therapies, but I actually think where some of our best and most important improvements in care might be, will be using the therapies that we have more effectively. And I think that data analytics are going to become really important. I mean, right now in the commercial world, if you're Nordstrom, you're looking at your data day by day, moment by moment, and you're adjusting to keep your space, your position in the marketplace. In medicine, we're just not doing that in a lot of places. I think we're really missing opportunities because we don't have data to actually even use the therapies we have to their maximum benefit, and we're losing opportunities to improve care and also see how our resource use is. So I think that this acquiring data and feeding it into these data visualization tools and using data analysis. I mean, I think it's incredibly exciting, and I really hope that we can embrace this more in OB-COPE and in healthcare in general. I think it's applicable to all specialties.
If I could add on that, if I could agree and add on that, in the rheumatology space as an example, docs like everybody else like the nice, new, shiny, fancy stuff. And very often, that old station wagon works just as good as that beautiful, shiny, new electric SUV, and it's probably cheaper. So people are jumping to biologicals, we believe, too quickly and giving up less expensive therapies that have not been fully used, fully utilized, as Vivian's saying, and going to very expensive new medications because they seem to be the best and brightest thing. So if we can really maximize the use of therapies that have not been maximized before we start jumping to untried, very expensive medications, I think we can save a lot of money.
I'll throw in one. I mean, Donna kind of laid this out earlier in terms of just the need to be looking at registries. You guys have some data sets that are very impressive. Talk to about just data acquisition on your end of how that comes about.
Can you answer that, Kristen?
Yeah, so some of the data, and I can speak most thoroughly about the OB data because that's the group that I work with most closely. But across all of our clinical programs, some of the data is uploaded directly from the electronic health record into the cloud-based data portal that we maintain with our data partner. And then there's actual human validation of that data and going through and adding. So there are some fields that are not discrete, easily uploadable fields. So somebody actually goes in and adds those and checks and validates the data that is uploaded as well. So and then they go through a data quality reporting process, and the data then is available to them on a real-time basis. Once that's finalized, they're able to view it through the reporting portal at each at the site level. So that's connected, those reporting tools are connected directly to their data entry.
Got it, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question for the folks that are presenting. So I represent rare diseases, specifically like hemophilia, some sickle cell, and people who have babies. Now there's a lot of people. And how does your data apply? A lot of these emerging therapies are specifically for rare diseases. They have very small groups of individuals. And so I would be, not that I disagree on registries, but like how would you use this to make sure that we don't, I imagine by the time you would get enough data, you would have actually probably served the amount of people that maybe potentially need the treatment. And so how would you apply this to rare?
So thank you for that question. We don't have a field specifically for example, hemophilias or even sickle cell, but we do have a free text field that we can put pregnancy complications into or pre-existing conditions. And so we do actually, I've gone through these free text fields. We do actually have quite a lot of information on some quite rare conditions. We also, because we are a collaborative, we've now got 20 hospitals participating. If there is something that we want to look at as a group, we can function, because obviously, even a big tertiary referral center, of which we have, I think, 7, one hospital really wouldn't be enough to look at all these cases. So we can actually work together with our other hospitals so that we can actually collect some meaningful data. And so this would be really helpful for us to know if there is something that's new on the market or some particular patient groups that we need to look at for pregnancy, we can work with our other, our 20 sites to actually collect and monitor that data.
And I think what we're thinking of from the perspective of a registry would be to set up a new registry for, like Duchenne's muscular dystrophy or spinal muscular atrophy, where we're tracking the outcomes of those patients that are getting these expensive gene therapies and being able to look at, differences in complications across the different facilities and the providers that are administering them, and then all the long-term outcome of some of these patients as well. So it wouldn't necessarily be adding on to the OB COPE. It would be creating a whole new registry to follow other cohorts of patients.
Although I do think that might be something we could look into, because we just heard about OB COPE, but there's also cardiac COPE and scope, surgery COPE, and I think the Foundation for Medical Quality has relationships with hospitals, and some of these expensive new therapies are mostly given in a hospital setting. And I guess if not inpatient hospital, or given in the outpatient hospital setting. So it might be interesting as a potential idea to sort of think about, is there a way that we could sort of utilize, and again, it'll be slightly different from what the foundation does right now, but it might be somewhat easier than setting up a brand new database, because some of the relationships are there and some of the database guts are there.
Yeah. Thanks, Judy. Other thoughts?
Although
questions?
that is totally new for John and his staff, so I'm not holding you to anything. I'm just brainstorming.
Yeah, no, I'm board certified in genetics as well as obstetrics and gynecology, so this is something that I'm really interested in as well. I think we struggle also at getting long-term outcomes, and I think as if we were Sweden, we'd be able to track everybody from pregnancy right through birth, long-term, but we really have very little long-term data on anything in the United States. And I think looking at ways to link all the pieces of data and different registries is, I think it's something that would be absolutely wonderful if we could do that in Washington State.
Mike, this is Valerie. Let me just throw one other piece into that, which is to say that there are rare outcomes and there are rare diseases, and that's a place where multiple insurers, multiple states, multiple entities contributing to a registry can really, really help. That does happen in the field of maternity care with CMQCC out of California, and I know Oregon gets its data analyzed and contributes to that database. So that may also be part of the pathway forward.
Thanks, Val. That's a good point. Other thoughts?
I just think that if 20 hospitals, they have not seen a lot of hemophilia patients, and where gene therapy is likely to be provided, maybe none of those hospitals are going to be providing gene therapy the way they're looking at developing that for hemophilia. And I just have to say, since hemophilia, especially those who would get gene therapy, will be almost 95 to 99% of them will be male. So they're not going to show up in any OB data. And so I think, I just think that it's really important that if we use registries and who we use, is that I think there could be some awesome things that are pulled from it for rare. Looking at different things, but just making sure that we really understand the questions that need to be answered for rare.
Right. Vivian, John, Chris, do you have thoughts on that? On what you have done, kind of taking it down another level to those, the rare diseases on those, and then specifically kind of linking to the emerging therapies?
In terms of our model, it would be right now sort of cost prohibitive to stand up another program like that. But But it's a very important point, because even with routine therapies for routine diseases, when they do these clinical trials, they're only doing them on a small number of people, a relatively small number of people, because that's all you can really do. So 7,000, 10,000 people. And then when you give this drug to 500,000 people, you've got side effects that didn't show up in those 10,000 people, or odd things that happen to people when you give it to that many. So you really have to look at large populations, and you have to follow it over a period of time. And so for these rarer diseases, if you had a registry, it would always have to be, I think, and again, I'm just talking out loud, a national, regional, national registry. So you can get, or maybe even an international registry, so you can get as much information in it as possible to tease out those little things that you won't be able to see in small populations. It's a very important question. It's one that we really do need to take under advisement.
This is Kristen, and I'll just add to that in that the platform that we use, it's relatively easy to set up a new registry in terms of defining what fields need to be collected. We're more acutely aware now than when our registries were initially developed, that if the more data that we can map to being easily uploadable makes it that much more simple to implement at the hospital level. So actually getting that part of it set up is not, it's not a big mountain to climb. So it's certainly something that we could look at for a number of different rare entities in implementing those simultaneously. So it's certainly something worth exploring.
And I think to Stephanie's point, what would it take to add like new facilities? Like Bloodworks Northwest would be seeing and administering, potentially these medications to hemophilia patients. So is there opportunity to add different provider types or facilities to the reporting cadre so that we could collect that kind of data? You'll have other FQHCs or hemophilia treatment centers that are, probably in connection with a hospital like OHSU, but there are some that would not be connected to a hospital.
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly do that. Like, for example, with the community births that we get, that's through a relationship we have with the Midwives Association of Washington State. So that being a professional organization where we get the data through them. So it's not exclusively a hospital-based model.
And go ahead.
Can I ask Stephanie? I was just going to ask. It seems to me that there's a lot of power from the consumer, from patients themselves, and that while it can sometimes be very difficult to get information from hospitals or physicians about, to monitor treatment, if patients themselves could actually provide the data for the database or the registry. There's a lot of that going on right now, even in our space in obstetrics. And I wondered if you had considered that as a source of data.
For me, like asking me, well, and then Donna probably, most of the gene therapy companies are following their patients pretty consistently, right? Because going to the conversation, there's not a lot of data to follow through on. The issue with gene therapy for something like hemophilia is the treatment's very fast. It takes less than a day, and then you don't have to do a lot of follow-up. So finding those patients to follow up with and making sure they continue to show up is what they're expecting to be difficult. And there's going to be so few. But it's also likely to be the first, disease state really to come to market that has quite a few patients. So yes, we can ask them to self-report. It's They just anticipate it to be difficult because they're going to be so excited that they're better. They don't want to go to the doctor. So yeah, there's a lot of discussion in the community on how to, you know, require or encourage them to continue to self-report. So.
Right. Judy, one thought that I had as John was talking about kind of economies of scale and regional, you know, something to think about, just another conversation with Pam on your other project. You know, at some point down the line, I don't know, but I mean, I think this could tie into something like that. But I mean, it's an interesting concept.
Yeah, and I mean, I like part of why we asked Valerie to speak was to talk a little bit about SMARTEN and how do you have multiple states work together to be able to get data from lots of places, because it is, a lot of these are more rare diseases, and so then that's harder to track outcomes and figure out effectiveness and figure out harms.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Mike and Judy, this is Val. I'll tag on to that just one piece to say, in any kind of registry activity, it's super important to get to good outcomes. And the better the outcome, the harder it is to gather. Usually there's inverse relationship there. But many times industry wants to gather a data point that is most favorable to how they look. And that isn't necessarily the outcome that matters to patients. So you have to think about, you know, in the field of the SMARTEN study with nusinersen, which functional motor measure are you going to gather, and what do parents really care about? It's incredibly important to get to good outcomes.
Yeah, thanks, Val. Hey, well, guys, we've got we're not holding everybody to 4 o'clock, so I want to make sure that we kind of cover our bases. But Lita, could you maybe throw up that slide, Val slide, just on the questions? I want to go back to that so we can maybe get people thinking about kind of both presentations and thinking more about, you know, what counsel advice, you know, are we looking at giving HCA in terms of kind of these next steps.
So what do we want to do for next steps? Is that what you were asking, Mike?
No, I was looking at, sorry, Lita, the slide, Val slide that had the questions.
Yeah, I'm getting there. It's slowly getting there.
There we go, thanks. So I think those were framed up. Yeah, so I mean, even starting with this first one, as you guys have kind of, you know, heard a number of things today, when you think about, you know, how HCAs should consider evidence, what's some initial feedback right now? Knowing that it can be all over the map.
Hey, this is Yusuf with Community Health Plan of Washington. Just been listening to the last presentation, and I've been struggling to see a direct relevance to emerging therapies and how the HCA might put something in place as a recommendation that's more immediate. You know, a lot of the data that's for collection and gathering, it's all very important and interesting findings longitudinally over time, over a number of systems. But the problem here is emerging therapies where the data is very limited, and I'm not clear on the relevance to a more immediate applicability to healthcare authority and emerging therapies.
Thanks, Yusuf. Other opinions on that?
Yeah, I'm going to give mine. It may not make a whole lot of sense, but you know, it's kind of a general question. I sort of have a general answer. And you know, I was a practicing internist, general internist, primary care doc for many years, maybe too many. And one of the things that always bugged me is new therapies that have just an incremental, marginal difference, improvement over what I'm already using but you know, not an incremental cost, a much higher cost, and it all of a sudden becomes the standard of care. That's always irked me. So I don't know how you determine what is an incremental benefit versus a real benefit when there are other therapies that are available. And I think that's kind of what Vivian was talking about earlier, about looking at, you know, getting the maximum out of what's already available rather than looking to something new. So I think whenever I look at a new medication or a new therapy, I look at what's already in my tool chest, and is this really just a different spin on what I already have, or is this actually something different? And with regard to this trade-offs, that's kind of part of that same question. You know, in order to answer that question, I think you have to be explicit about what is the benefit of what you're doing now, and what is the true benefit of doing something new, something that's called emerging. So that's my take on it.
Got it. Thanks, John.
This is Vivian. Yeah, I mean, I think there are two different issues here. There are, you know, obviously diseases where there really is no treatment or very limited treatment just now, and, you know, specifically rare diseases, and where, you know, really anything that looks like it might be of benefit is obviously very, very attractive. And then, and we just don't have many of these things in pregnancy. So that's why really our example is on a much broader issue, which is sort of benefits for, you know, a much broader part of the population and risks for a much broader part of the population. So I think there are two different kind of disease categories, you know, therapies that we're kind of talking about here in one forum.
Got it. Yeah, I see some other folks that are still with us, and I'd love to hear from some other work group members. Thomas, I still see you there. Petra, Carrie, others. Interested in your thoughts.
I'm still sort of processing all of the presentations. It's, you know, it's difficult to know, you know, or to set a final strategy for how to approach this evidence, you know, when there is mixed and, you know, not a single compelling sort of case to be made. So I'm still kind of processing, really.
Got it. Thanks, Thomas. Donna and Judy, have you guys, when you're thinking about kind of where we've been, even over the last year, and knowing you've got the pipeline coming, where are you with coverage with evidence development? I mean, thinking through this and how this plays out in the future.
I don't think we've gotten very far, other than, you know, we would have to be doing manual tracking of our own data when we have, you know, when we've made a coverage determination for one of these new emerging therapies, would just be trying to follow them based on our claims data over time. And as we're, for some of the medications that are ongoing, you know, we'll get renewal criteria, you know, we can request chart notes, because we'll have to continuously reevaluate the effectiveness of the treatment in order to determine whether or not we're going to continue it or continue to pay for it. I think what'll be really challenging, what everybody said, is some of these treatments that are one-time only, and, you know, we pay for it in the Medicaid population, but then they might migrate into, you know, a different health insurance company, and so then we no longer have visibility into their continued outcomes.
Got it. Don, are there things that would change with like MCO contracts that in terms of data, in terms of what you would be requiring of them as well?
Well, we get all of the data from the managed care plan, so we would just be internally mining it ourselves. A lot of those treatments are also carved out of the managed care responsibility, so they're covered through the fee-for-service program. But it would be potentially asking them to help us get data, contacting providers. We tried with the hepatitis C program, we tried to get outcomes, the follow-up 12, the SVR 12 tests and test results, and providers just were not cooperative in giving us that information so that we could have tried to track our outcomes within Medicaid.
Is the next, so thinking of that, the next step, I mean, everything that we just heard from Vivian, for the most part, it sounds like, those 20 hospitals, this is all voluntary. From a state perspective, is the next step legislation that would kind of require providers to be producing that type of information to you?
I think that this sort of information should be available for every hospital. Yes, I would like to see that. I think that, we're seeing also a call for greater public transparency of data as well. And I think there's going to be a big push for both purchasers and patients themselves to be able to get information about quality and services at different hospitals. So yes, I mean, I think if there was legislation, maybe to provide some subset or the whole of the OB-COPE data set, it would put our state in a really strong position to ensure both equity and quality of maternity care for every pregnant person in the state.
Mike, just kind of brainstorming, we talked about a regional or national registry. One of the, and to kind of to Stephanie's point, where manufacturers are following these patients, I think they'll probably have the most resources to try to follow these patients over time, even for those that are in a one-time, gene therapy. And it might be legislation that they have to make this data, publicly available or available to research, because the concern is that sure, the manufacturers are going to be I think they have to cover or follow them for like 20 years, but they're not going to be sharing the data. And so, is there a national registry that, maybe it's run by PCORI or something, where there's researchers within PCORI that can, be following the data from these manufacturers, and require the manufacturers to report their data to a centralized registry. Again, that requires national legislation, but it is a way to get there, because the data is going to be collected, but we're just not going to be able to see it.
Well, and Donna, I think that because hemophilia is likely to be first up for that bigger registry, I think the community would be very would likely to be supportive of that data being public, due to the history of hemophilia and being fearful that something was happening underneath new treatments that they weren't knowing about, and were knowing about them too late. And then I think having physicians provide some questions that they wanted to know as well, or the states that they wanted to know as well, and you could probably get some community support for that.
So just to piggyback on that, Val, I mean, when I think of DERP and MED, have there been any other discussions around registry type of activity?
Really, the SMARTEN Project is kind of first out of the box for that kind of registry gathering, even though it's a 30-month window. Obviously it could go longer if needed. The Med Collaborative has done some joint data gathering work and has looked at coverage policies and prices and things like that across states. So it's possible, but it's also a big lift, and you're asking states to essentially self-fund something. And so the juice has to be worth the squeeze. There are economies of scale, but it has to be a big enough price tag. And I will say that, by the time you get one project up and running, like in the SMA space, dang, they're going to have 3 more therapies out. So you have to really pay attention to the pipeline as well.
Yeah, yeah. No, great point. I'm just gonna hate to pick on folks. I would love to hear from other work group members. Petra, I know you were on for a while. I think you're still there. Carrie, thoughts?
Yeah, so this is Petra, and I've actually been on the whole time. I've just been kind of off and on the video. Had one of the things that strikes me about the data collection, there's a lot to be said for voluntary participation, but one thing you need to do if you're going to have that is you got to make it easy for people to participate, or to upload the data. If so, like using the example of the electronic health records that are automatically uploading, they need to be what they're uploading to has to be compatible with the systems that are out there, as opposed to expecting the providers to upgrade their systems so that they can then do this. And I'm a little concerned about legislating it, although I like the idea. I like the idea because you're going to get more data. But the concern that I have is that if you are having the data, you have to be pretty specific about the format in which the data is going to be coming, or it may not be all that usable. And,
right.
And the thing that comes to mind is if you require that chart notes come, but you don't specify the format in which they come, it may not be very searchable. And you may wind up having to literally go through everybody's charts to find the information, and that's just not practical from a research standpoint. So it is a little bit of a messy proposition, especially when you're thinking about costs.
Right.
Because
right.
there's going to be a cost outlay from somebody, and
yep.
These are also very, very pricey drugs, and so it is probably worth the investment. But we have to be cautious about how we do it to try and make sure that it is something that works well for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Petra. Yeah, no, great point. Jonathan, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Thoughts from you?
Lots of thoughts, lots of questions. This is one thing that, as powerful as the United States is, has missed the mark. Europe does this much better. Many countries in Europe do this much better, but there's a cost to that too. There's, the trade-off of, having government or legislation dictate or detail certain drugs or certain pathways or clinical trials compared to the open market we have here, and you're going to get pushback from pharma. So I would love to have, a huge data bank with just about every disease and every drug and every trial. The amount of just data mining to be able to come up with certain approaches to different medications and as well as diseases would be phenomenal. Clinicaltrials.gov, for those of you I know are very familiar with that, does have data, but that's not until a year after the study closes. So there really is, if we're looking at emergent therapies, how are we going to get that information? We could be one of the first states to get that on certain drugs or certain diseases, but like everyone has said, it does come at a cost, and whether the state needs to get behind something like that, I think is the question. And the first bullet is, how should the state consider evidence? And that's, I think, really the crux of the question. What type of evidence? What are we talking about? Are we talking anecdotal? Are we talking very small cohorts? There's a lot of questions that I think can steer us in the right direction, but there's also a lot that could steer us away from really the answer we're trying. So this is not an easy, and I know my answer's all over the place, but this is not an easy question to answer by any means. So this has been a great discussion.
Well, and thanks, Jonathan. No, I think your points are spot on. And this whole concept of, Petra, you hit it too, just the cost and the infrastructure of the data gathering. And I'm not saying this is a legislative mandate or even this is a legislative ask, but there also, I think, is a conversation to be had about the value proposition if there is that infrastructure in place to collect the data, that you put yourself in a position to actually lower costs over time. So, you know, how do you have that conversation? Otherwise, you could be on the hook for spending, you know, Val's example of whatever it was, Val, 1 point something billion over a period of time that turned out to be, you know, ineffective. So, you know, how do we prevent that from happening by making this upfront investment, right?
I think the state, to that point, Mike, the state could probably look at specific diseases or something that they subsidize and require every single institution to report on that. And that actually could be a pretty wide sweeping impact on specific diseases or specific, you know, therapies. To be honest, if the state's subsidizing it, they could certainly require institutions to report on that.
Got it. Thanks, Jonathan.
And Mike, I have a comment from Vivian. She said the NICE technology appraisal processes may be an interesting template to look at.
Yeah, Vivian, you want to talk more about that?
Well, this is the National Health Service in the UK. Their kind of process for assessing whether new technologies or drugs should be introduced. And I don't know a whole lot about this, and I think they're much more focused on cost. But they look at all sorts of things like the social implications of it and the effectiveness and the cost. And I just think as a group, it might be quite interesting to look at that. It's all available on the internet if you just go to nice.org and look for this. And I do think they've been really thoughtful about the components that should be considered and the populations where the drugs should be used or whatever. And, you know, it might be worth looking at that just as a template. On how you might want to.
Vivian, thank you for that. Val, you said something earlier, just on not of NICE, but of ICER, correct? They were doing some work in this space now.
So yeah, I thank you, Vivian, for that suggestion. I think those of us who are methodologists really respect NICE's process and think of it as being fairly state of the art, and they've really kept up. So in the UK, they do consider cost of care less so than they used to, I will say, as somebody who did a postdoc there 20 years ago. It's their quality threshold has really shifted over time. But they've got a good process, even if you don't think about the cost element or the cost effectiveness element, about a way of organizing what you're going to look at for discrete technologies and drugs. As far as ICER goes in the US, it's a health economics group, and they're the group that's behind, for example, the California Health Foundation's work on particular drugs and technologies. And they also work with a group of kind of upper northeastern states, and there's a Midwest collaborative. They take on a few really high profile, usually drugs, sometimes other devices and treatments, issues per year. They have changed and are changing their methodology just as NICE has. They typically project 3 cost effectiveness thresholds, depending on whatever quality threshold you want to use. I think those of us who are on the evidence side of the business sometimes question whether they are critical enough about the inputs into their models. And in my group, and by my group, I mean a whole international health technology assessment group of people, we often have maybe not so charitable thoughts around modelers and that desire to just find an input that fits into the model and not really being critical about how good an input that is. So the modeling technique and the method really matters. How does the model vary across areas where it's not uncertain or not known? That's critically important. So I would say on some of their reviews, ICER has done a better or worser job of that. More than you asked for, Mike, sorry.
No, thanks, Val. I'm just going down the list. I want to make sure we kind of get a chance from everybody. Carrie, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. I've really just been kind of thinking about the pipeline, actually, and then in terms of just thinking about COVID and the budget and how to best accommodate these new drugs that are coming to the market. I know working with Donna and the Healthcare Authority, there's several that we have in our contract that will be kind of carved out to the state, but are not even FDA approved yet, but they're in there just in case. And my mind is really on the pipeline and how we're going to best accommodate our members, knowing that we have a budget shortfall that will likely continue.
Yep. Thanks, Carrie. Is anybody on the phone that I missed that has other thoughts, comments? Well, guys, this was, I think, a robust one for sure. I think we got into more detail than like we were hoping to. This is not always black and white, right? That you kind of want to make it just really clean to say, oh, well, we're going to do this. It's just not that way. We've got all of this messiness among us, but I think I'm hopeful that this was robust enough to give HCA, I think, some frameworks really around how they could think about moving forward in this way. Judy, Donna, what are your thoughts on even kind of your own next steps as you have this conversation today?
Do you go first, Judy?
You can go.
Yeah, it's going to be really challenging to figure out, the best path forward. Whether it be, request legislation, which it wouldn't, just recommend, or not really request legislation, but recommendations to the legislature on maybe where, how they could improve some of the current statutes on coverage. If we were to go down the road of some sort of registry, I do believe it would require statutory action in order to do that, to get the compliance with the different entities. I just still scratch my head because we still, we're required to cover them, and I guess as the costs continue to increase over time and the federal government starts experiencing the impact of these medications, maybe they'll begin to take action. But again, it's like we are operating in an area where we really don't have the authority to make the changes that are necessary to do anything with these medications that with a lot of these topics that we've been discussing.
Thanks, Don.
I would love to be able to say, I'll pay you, $100,000 until we figure out that your drug actually works in the long term. Right now, it's just the state Medicaid program is now funding all of the manufacturers, post-marketing trials, and so and other payers. But for those with rare disease, they the majority of them do, fall into the Medicaid arena for coverage. So that's a conversation that the federal government really needs to take into consideration.
Right. Thanks, Donna. Judy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this has been a really helpful process, and there is this sort of push-pull tension between what the state can do and what the federal government can do, and how to sort that out. And yet, at the same time, there's also the state's obligation to deal with this. And so I think it's been really helpful to have these conversations, and I like these questions that are still on there. I think there's going to be more to be talked about. I'm not sure if there will be any action this legislative session on this space, because there's going to be a lot of other things to talk about. And certainly with COVID, I think, although you could perhaps say if the COVID vaccine happens, you know, what's the evidence? What's the price? How do we all pay for it? Does it work? Does it not work? Those are all the same questions we're struggling with now. So there aren't easy answers, which is why we pulled together this group. But I think there's some good structure to the problem.
And Judy, one thing as you were kind of summarizing that, I was also just thinking about Carrie's and Jonathan's point. I mean, I think the state budget situation that every state's in right now is dire as we've seen it in a very, very long time, right? And you're compounding that with this pipeline, right, of emerging therapies. And just, you know, kind of thinking through, like, how can HCA and maybe with Robin or others, you really start to, as best you can, quantify that pipeline, right? So we really start to look, you know, what that is going to be in those 3-5 years out. And does that then potentially justify some initial investment, you know, to do this sort of, you know, infrastructure development work, whether it's registry work or anything else? Because otherwise, you know, you really are kind of dead in the water of not having anything to respond to. So is there anything that you can kind of get ahead of the curve by even showing him, you know, if we do nothing, right, we know we've got this pipeline coming where we're going to be spending this much money. And if we make this smaller investment, we actually can give ourselves a chance. I don't know, just trying to think about how we can be as proactive as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that that's sort of a helpful idea. And I think figuring out what we're going to do is sort of necessary to do ahead of time, with the sort of rock in a hard place that we're being asked to cut 15% of our budget across the board. And that's getting rid of benefits. You know, there isn't an easy way to do that. And so, because in times of economic downturn, that's when more people end up on the Medicaid rolls. So there's not really another way to make such big cuts except by changing benefits or changing payment to benefits, which in some ways ends up as a cut to benefits, because if you get too low, people won't provide the service. And so I think, you know, it is something that we should be thinking about, because if we find, or when we find the 15% to cut now, some of these things in the pipeline could require us to cut another 5% because we have to cover them. And so how do we sort of weigh those trade-offs, and how do we make sure that people get the healthcare they need? I think it's a really hard question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Mike, I mean, this is where the drug and the, you know, the pharmacy, I guess, side of healthcare is quite different, because we are price takers. We don't get to say, you know, we have a budget crisis, we're only going to pay you, you know, $50,000 a year for this particular drug. We, all of the other services, we can say, we set a rate and we'll say, okay, for a knee replacement, we're going to pay X amount of dollars, regardless of which joint you use. So I think that's kind of the difference between, you know, some of the trade-offs and some of the, you know, evidence gathering ideas that were shared earlier today. And that's, I think, just the biggest challenge. So unless we can say, sure, we'll cover your drug, but this is what we're going to pay. And because we have to pay the pharmacy for dispensing the medication, in most part, you know, that's a challenge for those drugs that are self-administered. For maybe for physician-administered drugs, it'll be different. And maybe we begin purchasing the drugs directly from the manufacturer rather than, you know, having the provider buy it. And that way we're controlling what we want to pay for it.
Right, right. No, good, great point.
If I can chime in, it's Yusuf again, and I can't underscore Donna's points strongly enough, but just want to add to them even, because the irony I see is, even if a socialist system, for instance, has better ability to coordinate nationwide data gathering, etc. If you can't actually do anything with the data to negotiate pricing, it's that effective. And other systems, the irony is they have more open market ability on the government program side than we do. And it's not just the if the manufacturer participates in the drug rebate program that they can set the pricing. There's also the state programs and government programs subsidizing the free market commercial world, like patient assistance programs, where those are now being used to not just pay down the patient's assistance, but also reduce the commercial plans' exposure to drug cost. And so with commercial plans being able to use these free market mechanics or workarounds to bring down their pricing, we end up having to subsidize that, is what I'm seeing on the Medicaid side, because we don't have the option to use those open market principles. So I'm just saying that in summary, all the data, once we get it in place, if government programs can't actually effectively negotiate drugs with more free market principles, then our hands are tied on this one, and we end up subsidizing, the safety net is subsidizing the commercial world.
Right. Yep. Yep. No, thanks, Yusuf. Yeah, absolutely. Lita, can we talk about, with this group, we will get out meeting minutes, meeting summaries like you've done last time?
Yeah,
right?
so I'll put the presentations on the website, and I'll have the recording transcribed, so that'll take a couple weeks.
Okay. And then, as you know, Judy and Donna and Lita, as things evolve on the HCA front, if there's a, maybe a listserv or anything else on this front, we can kind of keep people informed of kind of future decisions and kind of go from there.
Great.
All right, but I can't thank everybody enough for a year's worth of work. I think you guys have made a tremendous progress. It's actually been interesting in my work as I work with other states. Other states are now looking at how do they implement an emerging therapies type of work group and just getting ahead of this like you guys are. So I would say you guys are far further ahead than almost every state right now. So kudos to you, even though I know this is difficult. I think you guys are at least having the right conversation at the right time. So kudos.
Thanks, Mike. It's hard to believe it's been a year already. It seems like just yesterday we started this. We were in Spokane. So
crazy.
COVID time is so weird.
So Donna, Judy, anything else on your end?
No, I just want to thank everybody for participating in the work group. It's really appreciated all of your input, all of your ideas, and the support that you've given us. So thank you very much. And Judy, what are next steps? I know originally we were going to have a kind of wrap it all up meeting that was a public meeting. What are the next steps on closing out this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be delayed a bit because of COVID, and we're starting mandatory furloughs next week. So that's going to impact all of our work and slow it down some. I think we still hope to have a pull it all together public meeting at some point in the future. But certainly we will add your names to a listserv and communication we do about this topic. And again, thank you so much for your time over the last year and your participation and thoughts. We really appreciate it. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. I think we'll sign off from here. We'll give you 7 minutes back.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Enjoy the sunshine. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.